It's a book called Ukraine versus Russia, Democracy, Revolution, Democracy, War. And it's essentially, well, what it is simply a collection of the many articles and blogs I did between 2010 and the end of 2016. So it's roughly, well, it's more or less exactly 6 years of coverage. I started writing these pieces. I mean, it starts with the election of 2010 when Yanukovych is elected. And I believe the last piece concerns Trump and Ukraine, something like that. It's a massive volume. I managed to write something like 300 blogs for the World Affairs Journal in those years, and then an additional 30, 40 articles of an op-ed-like character for a variety of other sources, plus an additional 30, 40 longer pieces, longer analytical pieces for places like Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and a number of other sites and journals. Anyway, I put this all together and divided it into 5 thematically organized chapters, and the result is this book. The first chapter deals with Ukraine under Yanukovych. Second chapter deals with Ukraine, well, the revolution in Ukraine after Yanukovych. Third chapter is on the Putin's Russia and what that's like. And then the fourth deals with the Russo-Ukrainian War. That's where many of the more controversial articles I published on the Donbass are collected. So those are thematic as well as sequential. And then the final chapter brings together the pieces I did dealing with history, memory, nationalism, language, things like that. But I'd say about 80% of everything I published over the last 6 years happens to be there. And, as I said, since it was all written at a particular point in time, I mean, the articles actually do tell a story. So they do tell a story of the rise and fall of Yanukovych. They tell a story of the Maidan Revolution and the aftermath. They tell a story of the emergence of this fascist state in Russia. They tell a story of the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, while at the same time, of course, focusing on particular issues that happen to have been of more interest to me. And as I said, the final chapter does not tell a story. It's thematic, dealing with questions of history, identity, memory, language, and the rest. I've been and still remain an optimist regarding Ukraine. I think it's made an enormous amount of progress, not under Yanukovych, but on the other hand, during Yanukovych, the society exhibited an enormous amount of resilience and strength, so that was the source of my optimism. I was, virtually from the very beginning, I was persuaded that Yanukovych would not survive. I was right on that. I am still persuaded that Putin and his system will not survive, well, the jury is still out on that particular question. I wasn't right on suggesting that Putin would not invade Crimea. I actually included that blog. It's a long analysis. I think it's a very good analysis. It just happens to have come up with the wrong conclusion. I suggested that it was irrational for him to do so. Well, he did it anyway. I still think it was irrational, by the way. So in that sense, I think the reasoning is right, but unfortunately, it's small consolation to Ukraine that the region was, after all, invaded. So many of those themes are pretty much the same, and I have to say that, I haven't fundamentally changed my positions. I thought 6 years ago that Ukraine's history was being neglected, was being perverted. I thought 6 years ago that Ukraine was being treated as this kind of orientalized other, that Ukrainians were being transformed into savages in a variety of other national narratives, including those of certain Ukrainians themselves. And that's been pretty much my position over the last few years. I think where my views have changed is precisely with regard to the controversy that has made me somewhat of a blacklisted individual in Canada. Namely, 6 years ago, I didn't have an articulated position on the Donbass. But since the invasion, and even more so today, I am absolutely certain that Ukraine will be committing suicide if it ever reincorporates the Donbass. As to what that means in terms of what Ukraine should do, that's another issue. But I'm certain that reincorporating this region will spell the end of Ukraine. And that, of course, as you know, is a source of controversy, as you can well imagine. It's something that's puzzled me for the last, well, at least for the last 6 years. And I've been railing about that as well, sometimes in my writings, usually in private or in public statements of one kind or other. And it's simply amazing to me that Ukrainian Americans and Ukrainian Canadians include within their ranks several hundred or several thousand highly articulate, highly educated intellectual types who may or may not be professors, that's not the point, but who are perfectly capable of expressing their ideas on a regular basis in the press and articles and books and the rest, and who are perfectly capable of addressing contemporary issues. That's the point. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of people who are fluent in English and can do it. And yet, Taras is absolutely right. I mean, it may not be 3, it's probably 4, maybe 5, once in a while someone contributes, but it should be several hundred. And if not several hundred, then at least 50 or 60. And instead, we've got a handful. As to why that's the case, partly it's a problem with academics. And after all, many of the people who do take positions on these kinds of issues, they do tend to be academics. There are far too few political scientists who study contemporary politics within the Ukrainian American, Ukrainian Canadian field. Lots of people do culture, literature, language, which is terrific. It's just that they're generally not going to be writing about Yanukovych or Putin or war. So there is a dearth of political scientists. And Khrushchev has mentioned this on many occasions. This has been one of his main points, that political science or politics more generally has been neglected by Ukrainian academics. There is also a reluctance and or inability to write in a manner that is comprehensible to the average educated individual. That's more a problem of academics in general. They have difficulty expressing themselves without using jargon. They have difficulty expressing themselves in 900 words, which is what you need to do if you're going to write an op-ed piece, perhaps even 600. They prefer 600 pages as opposed to 600 words. That too is a failing. Of course, that's true of of Americans, Canadians, and not just Ukrainian Americans and Ukrainian Canadians. So that too is a problem. I think finally there's also just something in the nature of a fear on the part of academics, here I mean Ukrainian academics in the West, to touch on controversial issues. And by definition, if you're writing about Ukraine, you will be touching on controversial issues. There's just no way avoiding it. You will be for Ukraine or against Russia. You're for the Ukrainian historical narrative and you're opposed to the Russian one. I mean, you're always going to be delving into controversy. And controversy can be can make one uneasy, but at the same time, it can be threatening. People are afraid about getting access to archives, perhaps. They're afraid that they might be put on a blacklist, for instance. Now, in my case, it's the Ukrainian community. It doesn't really matter. No one's going to stop greeting me when I visit my friends in Toronto. It's just that for many people, these sorts of things are terribly important because they might be involved in fundraising or in grant applications, things of that sort. So they prefer that. At the same time, there's always the criticism that you'll get from Ukraine's opponents. If you speak too openly about certain issues, you can be called a nationalist, a fascist, an anti-Semite, all these sorts of things. And, for someone at my stage of my career, I'm not worried about that. It doesn't matter. It's just water off the off the back of a duck. For someone who's 30, 40 or something like that, this might be a concern because they're interested in promoting careers. Anyway, the bottom line is, you're absolutely right. We've got too few people taking stands on too few issues. And of course, see, the flip side of that is also bad, because that means that Taras and I and Karatnetsky were always taking stands, and in a way, we've become predictable. You know, I know Taras and Adrian very well, and I know what both of them are going to say, and they probably know what I'm going to say, and people who read us will pretty much be able to predict what we're going to say. And we need more interesting, grounded, and somewhat more unpredictable analyses. But that means bringing in new people. Oh yes, I've been very, very critical about professors, intellectuals, policymakers. I've been taking on the so-called realists who argue that one has to deal realistically with Russia. I've been doing that for the last 6-7 years. I've taken on people with crazy notions about Ukraine. And most of those pieces that were produced, I'd say there are close to about 20 that deal specifically with that kind of criticism. Oh, I've taken Kissinger to task, by the way. I mean, Kissinger is a complete ignoramus when it comes to Ukraine, a highly smart man, but knows nothing about Ukraine and Russia, which is, scandalous if you think about it. But there are so many people like that. That, by the way, is one of the problems with so much of the analyses that we encounter. It's not so much that it's biased, although you find that too, but a lot of it is just simply ignorant and stupid. It's based on total lack of knowledge about historical contemporary analyses. And that's the sort of thing that people could point out without necessarily taking stands. It's not terribly controversial to point out that such and such a fact did or did not take place, and such an event took place in some other time, and so on. I mean, one could actually do that. But yes, I think that has to be done. But there too, as I said, if it's the same guy pointing out the same problem with the same people over and over again, at some point it begins to sound like a broken record. I'm actually proud of just about everything I wrote there. I was unremittingly critical of Yanukovych for 3 years, virtually from the start, all the way to the end. And starting in 2010, 2011, I was saying, this guy, he's done. It's just a matter of time. The end will come, the end is near, and so on. And I think I was spot on. Maybe some of the details were a little wrong, but fundamentally the criticism was absolutely valid. I also think I'm also very proud of the way I've been treating Putin's Russia. I have not minced a single word with regard to him or to Yanukovych. I think he is an authoritarian, he is a tyrant, he is a despot, he is a killer. And I believe he's constructed a fascist system, a fascist regime in Russia. I also am absolutely persuaded that this system is unviable. That is to say, it will ultimately, sooner or later, collapse. Now, when is that sooner or later going to happen? I don't quite know, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see uprisings or something fundamentally destabilizing within the next few years. I do, and I think I'm right on that, but of course, we'll see. Time will tell whether I'm actually correct as to the unviability or the lack of viability of the Russian system. Finally, I'm also, I've taken a very strong stand on the right of Ukrainians to have their own historical narratives, on the right of Ukrainians to have their own language and culture and identity and memory. And that, of course, means remembering bad things as well as good things, of course, acknowledging bad things as well as good things. It's just that Ukrainians have a right. They have a right as much as blacks have this right, as much as women have this right, to construct their own narrative, or narratives, if you prefer, and thereby come to some sort of understanding of who they are and what their position is in this world. As I said, that's not about whitewashing. It's not about endorsing fascism or nationalism. It's not about squeezing or pushing out Russians from Ukraine. It's simply about the fact that Ukrainians, as a colonized people, have a right to be like any other people in this world. Well, that's easy. It's been the pieces on the Donbass. You know, I mean, I've been arguing, for any number of reasons. The reasons shift, but it's been, I've been arguing, as I said, that Ukraine really would do well to think twice about taking back these territories. And that, of course, has caused all sorts of outrage within the community in Ukraine. I've been called a traitor. Lots of people have also found those positions very appropriate, by the way. 3 years ago, I think there were virtually no positive responses. Now I'd say it's roughly 50-50. But even so, those have been very controversial. Less controversial, also controversial, have been my calls for arming Ukraine. That's not all that unusual. Lots of people make that claim. But there are many people, less so within the Ukrainian community, more so within the American policy communities, who oftentimes disagree with that particular position. I mean, as I said, I've been relatively optimistic about Ukraine, and I think it's done an enormous number of very positive things over the last 3 years. You can just take a checklist or look at any of these studies, and whatever the field, whether it's the economy, banking, energy, education, the civil service, corruption, rule of law, things, and just go down the list, decentralization, budgets, and so on and so forth. Ukraine has embarked upon enormous changes. Now, the problem is that the vast majority of Ukrainians in Ukraine and the vast majority of people of Ukrainian descent in the United States, Canada, and Europe are of the opinion that c'est gopal, it's all lost. It's over and done with. And you can see that today in Ukraine with the demonstrations and the marches and the blockades. The credibility of the government is about 0. The legitimacy is probably about 10. Everybody believes that they're all totally corrupt. Nothing has changed. It's getting worse and worse and worse and worse. Well, Moscow doesn't have to create this narrative. That's the bottom line. Ukrainians have created this narrative. Ukrainians are sustaining this narrative, and Ukrainian Americans and Ukrainian Canadians are to a large degree sustaining and creating this narrative as well. To my mind, all you need to do is look at any number of indices, whether it's Freedom House, whether it's Vox Ukraine, whether it's the local NGOs in Ukraine. You can just measure, you can just see very clearly. And people want Ukraine, especially in the aftermath of the revolution, they want Ukraine to have become Switzerland in the course of 3 weeks. Well, that's just not going to happen. Ukraine will be a crummy place for the foreseeable future, but it's becoming increasingly less crummy as we speak. But that's just not doing the trick. So the result is people are making these claims that it's all over, it's all done with. And obviously, the Russians not being stupid or saying, well, hey, if the Ukrainians believe this, who are we to disagree? And all they need to do then is just point to any number of articles, any number of demonstrations, any number of claims made in the press, made in television and radio to support the view that Ukrainians themselves are persuaded that it's all over. I consistently, I rant and rail against this in public, here in New York and in other places where I've spoken before the community. And I've told people, listen, if you truly believe it's over, then you have to be consistent. If you think it's all over, after several revolutions, all these attempts, it's all over, your claim should be, let's bring back Yanukovych. That's the only way to go. Or better still, just give up the whole game, and let's call Putin and make Ukraine into Russia's 89th or 90th province. If it's all over, and then be consistent, then just give it up altogether. Or alternatively, if you don't think it's all over, if you're not willing to give it all up, then stop talking this stupid talk, because you're simply reinforcing the narrative, the Russian narrative, and at the same time simply leading to the further destabilization in Ukraine. Start looking at things objectively, and you'll see that the glass is sometimes half full, sometimes half empty, sometimes it's actually pretty full. It's not even half full, it's pretty full, depending on the sector that you're looking at. Well, the thing that surprises me still is the degree to which so many Americans, Canadians, and Europeans, who are otherwise sober, liberally minded, to use the Ukrainian word, normal. The degree to which so many people apologize and or love Putin. I am simply baffled by this. I can understand when one has some kind of deep love of Mother Russia, although that's a little silly, but okay, there are lots of people who are in love with the Russian language and culture and they feel impelled to defend Russia. Fair enough. But Putin, to be an apologist for Putin, that to me is simply incomprehensible. Now, that said, it's comprehensible when it's a fascist who does that, and there are enough fascists who like Putin. That makes sense. They're just supporting their own. I can understand when people on the far left do that, because they are so motivated by anti-Americanism usually that they'll support anybody as long as it's not an American. But then you've got people in the academic world, Ukrainians, some of them are Ukrainians and Ukrainian background, many of them are Americans, Canadians, West Europeans, who actually shed a tear of sympathy for one of the 21st century's greatest dictators, a man who has violated human and civil rights, not just in Ukraine, that's irrelevant, in Russia, in Mother Russia, a man who has also transformed, undermined the architectural system, security system of the last 70 years, a man who's embarking on wars, and who fundamentally has made everything worse for Russians themselves. So not only is he a criminal, not only is he a killer, not only is he a liar, he's a pretty terrible leader to boot. And yet, there are people who will bend over backwards and say, well, you got to understand. No, you do not got to understand. I think the comparison of Putin with Mussolini and Hitler is so appropriate. It's so spot on. It's so obvious. And it's still striking how many intellectuals will be reluctant even to scratch that for fear of treading on Putin's toes. And that to me is striking. I mean, 3 years ago, fine. 2 years ago, well, no. 1 year ago and now, how can you still support this man? It's just incomprehensible to me. And, mind you, you could at the same time still insist that the United States or the West and Russia have to find a modus vivendi, that there has to be a compromise. You can make all those claims, but my point is, how can you actually admire, like, and defend one of the bloodiest dictators of the 21st century? That to me is incomprehensible and very surprising. I think, underlying a lot of this is a deeper sense of crisis within Europe and North America. How many people, especially within the intellectual class, how many of them are truly committed to liberalism, democracy, and human rights? How many of them truly believe in the European Union and the things that America and Canada supposedly stand for? How many of them would be willing to risk something for the defense of these things? Academics can be very supportive of of human rights violations, or very critical, rather, of human rights violations in Timbuktu. The closer it comes to home, the pusillanimous they tend to become. And that's been my... Again, there are many exceptions to this rule, but I think it's still a rule. It's a rule that tends to hold true. And in Europe especially, you see, part of the problem is that I'm not sure that Europeans fully appreciate what they have, or, with the European Union. They've created something quite remarkable, and they appear to be taking it for granted. They appear to be willing to abandon it for the sake of ephemeral interests, and they appear to be willing to kowtow to Putin. If they were true Democrats, they would never do that. Well, that's certainly part of the issue. Zbigniew Brzezinski has made this claim many times. I believe the first time was about 20, 30 years ago, where he said that without Ukraine, Russia is not an empire. So it needs Ukraine to be an empire. And of course, by extension, it needs Ukraine to have that imperial sense of self. And that's clearly an issue for the Russians. They have not fully determined who they are, what they are, where their boundaries are. And of course, the problem internally is also very important because not only, does Russia extend into Belarus? Does it extend into Ukraine? Does it extend into northern Kazakhstan? This is question number one. Question number two is, how about all those many non-Russians who have their own republics within the Russian Federation? Are they Russian? Are they not Russian? To what degree are they Russian? I mean, these are all issues that they have to grapple with. My own view of these things is somewhat similar to this. I mean, I tend to put the identity question within the larger framework of Russia's being a post-imperial state. When empires collapse, and they happen to be fairly large at the time that they collapse, what the remnants of the empire generally tend to do is they try to revive the state. There's still a kind of ideological longing. There are all sorts of connections with the former colonies. You have all sorts of institutional, structural, and economic ties, and all of this facilitates attempts on the part of the former imperial core to try to resuscitate the empire. So we saw that, for instance, in 1917, 1918, the Romanov Empire falls apart at its height, and the Bolsheviks try to resuscitate it, and they succeed, as we know. The Germans tried to do that. The Nazis tried to do that after the collapse of their empire. Temporarily they succeeded, and then ultimately they failed. And in that sense, contemporary Russia is the remnant, or the core, if you like, the metropole of the empire of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Russian Empire that collapsed in 1991. That longing for empire, this desire to establish the Ruski Mir, to extend assistance to Russian speakers, to see them as part of your nation, and then eventually to try to extend your own political, economic, and cultural control over parts of the former Soviet Union. This is typical. This is similar to what the Bolsheviks did in more concentrated form, similar to what the Nazis were doing in the 1930s. And then the only question is, will the Russians succeed at this time or not? Right? My own answer to that question is that they'll fail. And this is where I'm an optimist, precisely because this Russian system that Putin has created is simply too weak. It cannot resuscitate the empire. And we see that even at present, right? I mean, they're trying to do this, and at the same time, they're meeting resistance. Even Ukraine has managed to stop the Russian military onslaught. They provoked the resistance of the Belarusians, of the Finns, of the Swedes, of the Poles. The Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians are forming new brigades and preparing for warfare. NATO has been mobilized. Putin has done everything in his power to isolate Russia. I mean, he has to qualify as either the most irrational or the worst Russian leader of recent memory. That is, again, another reason for the surprise I feel that people like him. I mean, how can they like an incompetent leader? I mean, the guy is he's just incapable of making good decisions. He's going to destroy Russia. From Ukraine's perspective, that might not be the worst possible outcome. I mean, from Russia's perspective, obviously that is. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.